It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Chicago Bears need more from their defensive line in 2021. That means a return to form for Akiem Hicks. That means Eddie Goldman back in the lineup. That means perhaps a bigger role for Mario Edwards on his new contract, and maybe finding another one of these hidden gems that the Bears have made a habit of. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm an analyst for Pro Football Focus, and I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for more Bears talk, and remember that you subscribe to the Locked On Bears YouTube channel for all of our video content as well. On the show today, we continue our Bears training camp positional previews with the defensive line. We're not just going to go player by player down the depth chart and break things down in the same old boring way. We've been hitting storylines and the biggest questions and everything we need answered in training camp ahead of this 2021 regular season. So we'll start with quite a bit of money invested in this defensive line and whether or not the Bears can still get their money's worth given where things trended last year and whether or not things can start to turn around a little bit or maybe bounce back in a way that the Bears are certainly hoping for. We'll also look at Mario Edwards Jr. and his expanding role, what he was able to do last year, what we should expect in year two, and whether or not a bigger role and a bigger contract might reduce some of what made him so effective last season. And then we'll wrap up with the search for the next hidden gem on this Bears defensive line. They've been able to find guys off the street as really unheralded players that come to Chicago and play on the defensive line in particular on a high level. So we'll go through some of the different candidates there and whether or not there's hope for something special on this Bears bench. But let's start with the financial investment that the Bears have in this defensive line because they are one of the highest spending defensive lines in the NFL. I believe their position group spending ranks 6th among all teams in the NFL in most money spent on specifically interior defensive line players. So not the edge rushers or the linebackers, but just your defensive ends and your defensive tackles, your nose tackles, all the big guys up front. The Bears are big spenders up there. And last year, they didn't really get as consistent of production out of that group as we might have liked. And it certainly expanded beyond the defensive line, but that's a little bit more of a specific focus of ours today is that group up front. A big reason, the loss of Eddie Goldman last year. He is expected to be back. We'll get into a little bit more of that in a minute, but really it's Goldman and Hicks that a lot of the Bears' expenses are really concentrated in. The Bears are one of 2 teams in the NFL that have 2 of the 15 highest paid defensive linemen in the league. The only other team is the Pittsburgh Steelers with Cameron Hayward and Stephon Tuitt, both slightly more paid than Hicks and Goldman, who are both towards the bottom of that list. But still, it's a lot of money, and you want to get a very nice return on that investment if you're the Chicago Bears. And so for me, it starts with Akiem Hicks, a player I'm still a big fan of, one of my favorite Bears. I think really one of the most likable people on the team, if we're being totally honest. And in no way do I think the team should even approach cutting or trading him for salary the way they talked about early in this offseason. But at the same time, I think we can fairly say that he did show some signs of slowing down a little bit last year. And that's not to say he can't bounce back this season, but he didn't play at the same level as we are consistently used to from Akiem Hicks. And for me, it's not about the sacks. There was a decrease in his sack total, absolutely. But for me, it's the same conversation we have about Khalil Mack and that we'll have on tomorrow's podcast about the outside linebackers, where there's more to pass rushing than just the sack numbers. And with Hicks, like Mack, the total number of sacks was down, but the number of hits, like quarterback hits, where he gets to the quarterback but doesn't quite get the sack, but still hits him to the ground, that was up. And his number of pressures was about the same. And it equaled out to he was winning his pass rushes about the same as he did in previous years. It's just the quarterbacks were getting rid of the ball before he could get there, and maybe wasn't closing quite in the same way that he had been in years past. Maybe the closing speed is a slight sign of decline, but he's beating blockers at about the same rate. So I'm not as concerned in that area as I am in run defense. That was really Hicks's bread and butter for a lot of his Bears career. Him knifing into the backfield and making those big stops. We just didn't see as much of that. We didn't see him as consistently holding his gaps, penetrating, making those kinds of plays. And in exchange, we saw, I believe, a career high in missed tackles as well for Akiem. Energy wasn't quite there the same way. The mojo, just the whole defense didn't quite have that same juice. And Hicks, I think, is slightly a part of that. We've just seen him be so dominant against the run in particular. And it's apparent when a very dominant player, even in one specific area, is not as dominant in that area anymore. You really notice it quite a bit more. And maybe that's why we had these sort of rumor report discussions about Hicks maybe leaving the team as a salary cap change. And now this is the last year of his contract, and it kind of feels like maybe this could be his last year as a Chicago Bear. Certainly the last year at this price point at $12 million a year, but it's not trending in the right direction after last season. But there's an opportunity for him to bounce back this year, especially if you add Eddie Goldman right back into the mix on the interior. Another very well-paid defensive lineman. Again, top 15 highest-paid defensive lineman in the NFL. And we don't have to go through again the whole will he be there, will he won't discussion. We did a whole podcast about whether we should be worried about Eddie Goldman just a couple of weeks ago. So if you haven't heard that, make sure you go back and listen to it, because we go through some of the different dynamics about why he may or may not be concerned about, coming back to the team and everything else going on with this organization and with COVID and all this stuff. We really kind of went through the details on Eddie Goldman a couple of weeks ago, so we won't belabor the point again. But what I do think is that if he comes back, and assuming he does, he's going to need to pick up where he left off, right? There's going to be some rust for sure after missing a whole season and now not being there for mandatory mini camps and voluntary mini camps. But I think you need to use the training camp, the preseason, to really get that out of the way so that he can be as effective as possible by week one. And this whole defensive line can be locked in and ready to go, ready to get back to a little bit more of that earlier Fangio style defensive form that we saw in 2018 and to a lesser extent 2019. There was a drop off in 2020, and we are ready for more once again from a really critical and well-paid group up front in 2021. Also ready for more from a guy like Mario Edwards Jr. in particular. Had a big season off the bench last season, got a little bit of a payday, and now expectations are going to be a little bit higher. But we'll try and dive into a little bit of what this growing role could look like with some of the turnover up front next on Locked On Bears. It amazes me that even as we're in the middle of July, our friends at BetOnlineag keep adding new prop bets for this upcoming football season. The latest round that they've added is some positional yardage leaders. Who's going to lead the NFL in passing yards, rushing yards, and receiving yards? And right now, Allen Robinson, I believe, tied for around 14th for odds to be the receiving yards leader this season. David Montgomery, a long shot for rushing yards leader, as are Andy Dalton and Justin Fields for the odds to be the passing yards leader. Maybe not going to find too many bets there, but if the quarterback play is better, Allen Robinson has the chance to really produce this season. And if there's one place you're going to lay some money down, it's got to be betonline.ag. It's the number one place we trust and the number one place we recommend. Sign up today for a free account and enter our promo code Locked On to receive your free 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. It's been a little while since a guy like Mario Edwards Jr. has had real, high expectations about what he needs to produce in an upcoming season. He came into the NFL with those real expectations. It was a fairly high draft pick for the then Oakland Raiders. I always have to be careful of to think about, okay, what year was that? Where were they playing at the time? But second round pick by the Raiders, and really pretty quickly found his way into the starting lineup as a rookie and, didn't rack up big time sack numbers, but played pretty well. I think gave them enough to feel like, all right, that was progress. That was pretty good for what we were expecting from a guy drafted in, top 64 picks, certainly in that second round. Goes into year 2 and he suffers the hip injury, spends most of the season on injured reserve. Really don't get to see much of Mario Edwards' progress. Year 3, back into the starting lineup, a bit underwhelming. Really didn't show a lot of progress from where he had been in his first season. You wonder if maybe some lingering hip stuff or just maybe a little bit banged up here and there. He did finish the season with some kind of minor injury, missed like the last game or so, but just wasn't really the guy they envisioned with that second round pick. Then, 3 years into his career. And so they move on and signs with the New York Giants, does the rotational thing there. Doesn't play a ton, but I think 6th, 7th offensive or defensive lineman off of the bench, getting some opportunities in there, but really not really thriving. And it wasn't necessarily a great Giants defense either. But regardless, some up and down there. Then same kind of thing with the Saints. A few flashes, makes a couple plays, but not really carving out an extreme role for himself. Nothing as consistent as we saw last season in terms of playing time by the time he got going down the year with the Bears. Really sort of reemerging as an efficient pass rusher off of the bench. It seems like when Mario Edwards would come in, he brought this level of energy that the Bears struggled to find elsewhere. Like too often it felt like, the guys were out there, but especially, in that middle chunk of the season during the 6-game losing streak, they weren't juiced up. They didn't have that swagger, but it felt like Mario Edwards could at least come in and be a high motor pass rusher and get to the quarterback a few times, generate some pressure and give them that spark that was really needed. And I believe it represented a career high in total sacks for Mario Edwards. Again, like we were just talking about, trying to get too caught up in the sacks compared to the pressures and winning as a pass rusher as opposed to finishing at the quarterback. But all of that brings him into this year on a higher contract, not the money Roy Robertson Harris got elsewhere, but a increase in pay that is noticeable for Mario Edwards. But now you're not going to get as much of that catching a team by surprise when he comes off the bench. They're going to be a little bit more aware of his skill set and his repertoire. And I think that will also bring some more expectations now that he's on a multi-year deal and not just someone they took a flyer on from another team, kind of a late veteran addition to this defensive line. Now there's some real expectations behind it. Last year, gets plenty of rest coming off the bench. It's not like you just get one play at a time, like you'd come in for a series or whatever, but it wasn't as though he was being asked to be this every down, consistent, always on the field type guy. And so he could be very fresh each and every time. But you wonder, as he increases from, he was at like 15 to 20 snaps a game last year, maybe stepping that up to 25, 30, depending on how that rotation starts to go. Will he be as effective in a larger role when he doesn't have as much rest, when he's not necessarily the mercenary that can just kind of come in and be that pass rusher in those pass rushing situations? They might need him to be a little bit more this season because, gone are Brent Urban, John Jenkins, Roy Robertson Harris. It represents about 900 snaps that the Bears have to fill. Goldman will take a decent amount. Angelo Blackson, some of the other defensive linemen will take some too, but you move the different pieces around and Edwards is probably going to have more than the 275-ish he had last season. And so there's a question there of, will it just be a one-year wonder type thing? And now that he's got the big contract, will that start to slow down a little bit, or can he kind of keep things going? Because there's sort of two different paths here. Maybe he was successful because he was in that rotational role and fresh, and Bears putting him in advantageous situations where he could kind of focus on individual tasks and not have to be that cerebral every down defensive lineman. Or there's an alternative path here where just being able to play with Khalil Mack, Akiem Hicks, Robert Quinn, and now Eddie Goldman, in addition to everyone else, playing with those guys puts him in a position where he can be more successful, where he has easier matchups and less focus from opposing offensive lines, tight ends, running backs helping to block and chip, and can work a little bit more independently in more advantageous situations. That's not going to change from last year to this year. I mean, as long as those guys stay healthy. So there's a real opportunity for him here to pick up and keep moving forward. It's just a matter of how all these new pieces start to fit together. There has been some of that turnover up front, and especially assuming Eddie Goldman is there, because if he's not there, then there's even more snaps that you kind of have to start moving around. And hey, maybe there's an opportunity here for another one of these unheralded defensive linemen to be the next Mario Edwards and step in off the bench and be something more than the expectations we had for them. We'll take a look at some of the other potential hidden gems and top candidates already on the roster next on Locked On Bears. The defensive line can feel like a lot of moving parts when you get into some of these big rotations. But hey, nobody knows more about moving parts than our friends at RockAuto.com. They're a family business that have been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years. With Rock Auto, you no longer have to go to the chain part store because, you walk in, you talk to the person behind the counter, and they ask you 1,000 questions about the part you're looking for, and they're kind of inquisitive and questioning whether you know what you're talking about. You finally describe the right part for them. They punch it in their computer. They go look in the back. They don't even have it in stock anyway, and they have to ship it to you. Why not cut out the middleman? Check out rockauto.com because they have everything you could possibly need for your vehicle. Their website is super easy to use. You just enter in your car's make and model and quickly pull up all the different parts you need for your vehicle and sort by the brands, specifications, and prices you prefer. Because a lot of those chain stores, they'll have a different price tier if you're a professional mechanic versus a do-it-yourselfer like us. So don't spend up to twice as much for the same part somewhere else. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. One of the most important parts of my day every day is my daily Built Bar. It's the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, and it tastes so good, it's hard for me to only eat one each day. I legitimately have to limit myself because it's sweet, it's chocolatey, every flavor is covered in 100% real chocolate, and delicious, but it's also good for you because every Built Bar, it's soft and easy to chew, but here's the kicker. Low calories, low sugar, high fiber, and high protein. I'm telling you, you can't find anything with this mix of nutrients and deliciousness anywhere else. I have tried every single flavor. I promise you can't go wrong with any of them. They make a mixed box where you can try them all, get the flavor for yourself. But my favorites personally, salted caramel, raspberry, coconut, and cookies and cream. Oh, I can't wait to have another one. I'm telling you, head on over to builtbar.com and check it out for yourself. Use our promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at builtbar.com. The Bears have done such a good job of finding some of these lesser-known defensive linemen in recent seasons, and I think it's gone a little bit overlooked outside of the real diehard Bears fans that are paying attention to the important things on the underbelly of the roster. I mean, these are the guys that are not household names. They're not the guys that get a lot of credit or make a lot of flashy plays, but they step in and do their job consistently, and then occasionally you get the big splash when you need it most, and it's been a consistent pattern up to this point that the Bears have been super fortunate to get great value out of inexpensive and sort of off the street free agents. You think back, it started kind of even with Mitch Unrein I think that was the John Fox years, but under Vic Fangio. And then the same defensive coaching staff kind of sat through with Matt Nagy, but Roy Robertson Harris comes in as an undrafted free agent and builds up to be this valuable defensive line piece that the Jaguars went and spend quite a bit of money on. You had just a couple of years ago, Nick Williams kind of comes out of nowhere and has a 6-sack season, career high, and gets a big payday from Detroit. Even Akiem Hicks still tweets about how good Nick Williams is, and they have a really good friendship and all those different things. Then last year, or a couple years ago, Brent Urban started to emerge in that just solid rotational defensive line guy. And then now Mario Edwards Jr. is the latest to cash in after coming to Chicago, really kind of just trying to get his career back on track. And this is the place where some of these defensive line reclamation projects have been successful. And so when you kind of look at some of those guys in the names, it seemed to me a trend of guys who came like late at the end of one season and then stuck around on the roster through the entire offseason and then emerged the following year. I think Brent Urban came late in the year, Nick Williams, Mitch Unrein. Edwards, I think, was just a one-time thing in Chicago. Didn't really, have that advanced work in the organization, but not really a guy on the roster right now on this defensive line that isn't one of the top guys and also was here in the previous years. It's been a lot of turnover on the end of the bench players. But for me, there are still, I think, 3 main potential candidates here to be hidden gems on this roster. Start with Angelo Blackson. He was the defensive lineman from the Cardinals. The Bears signed surprisingly early in free agency. Wasn't right out of the gate, wasn't a big money signing, but was earlier than you might expect for a defensive lineman of his caliber and of his just where he kind of stands among the NFL. I mean, for me, I got to be honest with you, going back through and watching his tape from Arizona and Houston before that, I've got pretty low expectations. I was surprised when they signed him and gave him the kind of money he did. It's only a couple $1 million, but to me, he seems more like a veteran minimum type guy. I mean, he was a starter in Houston and a part-time starter in Arizona, if I remember correctly, and played a lot of snaps in that regard, but just kind of a below average defensive lineman, big body, takes up some space, but not a guy that eats space, right? There's a difference there between being a space eater and a guy who takes up space. For me, Angelo Blackson was a guy that, a blocker will have to stay in front of him because you have to block defensive lineman, but he's not making a lot of big plays. He's not collapsing gaps, even if he's not beating the blocker. He's just not getting a lot of movement up front. He's just kind of almost playing patty cake with the offensive lineman a little more often than I'd like to see. And, you wouldn't expect him to be a big sack guy either as a big defensive lineman. I'm not trying to hold pass rushing against him all that much, but he's just never really shown a consistency that for me validates him as a potential piece in this defensive line, and certainly not really a hidden gem candidate. I think he had the 3rd or 4th most missed tackles of any defensive lineman in the NFL last season. And from a missed tackle rate, he was 2nd highest in the league. So it's just, that one to me is underwhelming, but I am willing to give him some benefit of the doubt under this idea that we talked about with Mario Edwards, where maybe playing with Akiem Hicks and Eddie Goldman and Khalil Mack and Roquan Smith and all those different players can give him that bump up, that maybe he wasn't playing with good enough talent around him in years past, and the Chicago Bears can be the right mix of opportunity and teammates to have his potential emergence there. So I'm not gonna predispose myself to rooting for him to fail or anything like that, but just coming in with lower expectations for me based on what we've seen from him in years past. Whereas, on the other hand, another candidate, Mike Pennell, seems to me like the much stronger candidate to be a hidden gem here. Very late signing, just was it last month in June, as Eddie Goldman's status was a little bit murky and still maybe is. But for me, a guy like Pennell has been more consistent throughout his career than Angelo Blackson. Not flashy, but just solid nose tackle, can bump out to the 3 technique a little bit here and there, but big interior guy. And he's more of a space eater as opposed to a space filler, like we talked about. He's not the guy that's gonna do the Akiem Hicks, swim move off the snap, shed the block, and blow up the running back in the backfield for a 4-yard loss. Like, he's not explosive in that way, but he feels a lot more like in the Brent Urban mold here of just does his job consistently. He's the kind of guy who's going to engage the offensive lineman and maybe push him into the gap a little bit. He's not going to close the gap, but he might make the running back have to make a little cut or change his path and slow him down just enough to allow the linebackers to flow through a little bit. Those types of kind of subtle defensive line plays. That's what we think of as the dirty work. When we talk about defensive linemen, being really good at the dirty work. For me, Mike Pennell has been that guy. So I think he would be my betting favorite of this defensive line group to be that surprising player that comes in on a veteran minimum contract and really emerges as something particularly valuable for this defensive line. The last guy I'll throw in there is Kairis Tonga, the 7th round pick out of BYU. Odds are pretty well stacked against him to make this 53-man roster. I mean, he's a 7th round pick. There's a reason he lasted that long in the NFL draft. So it's also not all that often that we see defensive linemen really break out and emerge as rookies. We did see it just 2 years ago with Bilal Nichols as a 5th round pick, really blowing all of our expectations out of the water. So it's possible, and the path is potentially there, but there's a good 5 guys at least ahead of Tonga already in terms of players that are going to command more playing time than him. And he is going to be a little bit more of a developmental prospect there. You like the potential. I mean, there's a reason the Bears used a draft pick on him as opposed to waiting and trying to sign him as an undrafted free agent. It's just, I think especially signing Pennell was kind of that blow to Tonga because they're both more of the nose tackle role as opposed to the bump out to the defensive end type spot. And Pennell kind of signals that, yeah, Tonga is probably a little bit more destined for the practice squad as a rookie. But I think for me, the biggest concern is that this defensive line development was more about the defensive line coach, Jay Rodgers, than it was about Ryan Pace and the Bears pro scouts finding really talented defensive linemen. You know, the scouts' job is to find the talent, but the coaches are the ones that really bring the most out of them. And so this past offseason, defensive line coach Jay Rodgers leaves. In comes new defensive line coach Chris Rumpf, who may very well be a fine coach. I'm going to give him every opportunity to develop these players and be a good coach, and eager to see what he's able to do. But Jay Rodgers is one of the best defensive line coaches in the NFL, renowned outside of Chicago. Before he came to Chicago, I mean, he's a known figure in the defensive line coaching community, and that's just going to be hard to replace. So it's a big task ahead of Sean Desai, the new defensive coordinator, to navigate some new positional coaches for his guys, something we will definitely be keeping a close eye on here throughout training camp and into the regular season right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure that you subscribe to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. We will be back next week as we get back to a full 5-day-a-week podcast schedule. We are shifting out of off-season mode into preseason training camp mode and ramping back up to our full line of production. Training camp previews will continue, and then we will make sure you are all set for when the players report later this month. So I hope you'll keep following along. I hope you'll check out, subscribe, like, and comment on our YouTube channel. And I hope you've had some fun along the way. I hope we've gotten you through. We're not to the finish line yet, but I hope this has helped you get through this dry portion of the offseason. And more than anything else, I hope it's helped you